Welcome back to our channel. Today, we have a spine-chilling story based on real events that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Get ready to dive into a dark mystery involving disappearances, a haunted forest, and a terror that lurks in the shadows. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any chapter of this terrifying tale. And share it with your friends, if you dare. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's uncover what really hides in the whispering forest. Chapter 1. The Silent Village. Cerro Negro was a quiet village isolated from the modern world by the surrounding mountains. The houses were old, built of wood and stone, and the residents lived a simple life, in harmony with the nature around them. But there was something in that village that unsettled even the most skeptical, the whispering forest. The elders always warned the young never to enter the forest after dark. They said it was a place where time didn't follow the rules of the outside world, where day turned to night in the blink of an eye, and where the souls of those who got lost there wandered eternally. Pedro, a 24-year-old young man, always dismissed these stories. To him, they were just myths told to keep people away from the dangers of the dense forest. He never believed in ghosts or spirits, but the curiosity about what really happened in the whispering forest was always on his mind. Determined to debunk the mystery and prove that there was nothing supernatural, Pedro planned a visit to the forest during the night. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook to record his observations, he was determined to discover the truth. However, the truth he sought was far darker than he could have imagined. Chapter 2. The Path of Darkness. That night, Pedro set out towards the forest, determined and confident. The path to the forest's entrance was familiar, but that night, everything seemed different. The wind was colder, the silence was absolute, and the darkness was thicker than usual. As he approached the entrance, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if he were being watched. But Pedro ignored this feeling, convinced it was just nerves getting the better of him. He turned on his flashlight and entered the forest. As he walked, the sound of crickets and other nocturnal insects faded away, replaced by a deep silence. The trees around him were enormous, with thick trunks and roots that seemed to rise from the ground like claws. The leaves rustled gently, but there was no wind. Pedro followed the main trail, feeling increasingly uneasy. The ground beneath his feet felt softer, almost as if he were treading on something that shouldn't be there. Then, suddenly, he heard the first whisper. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Pedro stopped and swung the flashlight around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. He continued walking, but the whisper returned, this time louder, clearer. He couldn't understand the words, but the sense of dread grew with each step. Something was wrong, but Pedro refused to believe it. He had to keep going. Chapter 3. The Moving Shadows. As he moved further down the trail, Pedro began to notice something strange in the shadows around him. They seemed to move, but not like normal shadows. They moved independently, almost as if they had a life of their own. He stopped again, taking a deep breath to stay calm. He pointed the flashlight at the ground and saw that his shadow was strangely elongated, distorted, as if it were being pulled by something deep within the forest. Suddenly, he heard a crack behind him. Pedro whipped his head around, but there was nothing there. Just trees, which now seemed even more menacing. The whisper returned, but this time, it wasn't alone. Another sound joined it, something more guttural, a low growl that seemed to come from the shadows. Pedro felt his heart race, but forced himself to keep going. He was convinced that all this was a product of his imagination, a combination of fatigue and nerves. But then, something crossed his field of vision, too quickly for him to identify. It looked like a figure, but there was no definite shape, just a mass of darkness that disappeared among the trees. Pedro felt a wave of panic. He started walking faster, but the shadows seemed to follow his steps, always at the edge of his vision. The whisper became a constant hum in his ears, mixed with the sound of branches snapping in the distance. Pedro knew something was very wrong, but he could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. The forest, which once seemed so familiar, had now become a labyrinth of shadows and sounds he couldn't comprehend. He needed to get out, but the path back seemed to drift further away with each step. Chapter 4. The Macabre Discovery. After what felt like an eternity walking in circles, Pedro finally reached a small clearing. In the center, there was something that shouldn't have been there, an old wooden cabin, covered in moss and almost hidden by the surrounding trees. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for decades, but Pedro couldn't understand how he had never heard of it before. The sense of dread was almost unbearable, but something drew him inside, as if an invisible force was guiding him. He opened the creaky door and stepped inside, lighting up the interior with his flashlight. The smell of mold was strong, and the interior was covered in dust and cobwebs. Pedro explored the cabin, his steps echoing on the rotten wooden floor. When he reached the center of the room, he found something that made his blood run cold. On the floor was a circle of extinguished candles, and in the center, a strange mark carved into the floor, something that looked like an ancient symbol, full of meanings Pedro couldn't comprehend. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the next room. With his heart in his throat, Pedro slowly approached and opened the door, only to find an empty room, except for an old, dusty bed. But as he turned to leave, the cabin door slammed shut with a loud bang, leaving him trapped in the dark. Chapter 5. The Whisper of the Past. Trapped in the darkness of the cabin, Pedro began to feel the weight of the atmosphere around him. It was as if the cabin was alive, breathing, waiting. The whisper returned, louder, closer, as if it was whispering in his ear. But this time, Pedro began to understand the words. They spoke of pain, of loss, of something that had happened in that forest a long time ago. He felt a pressure in his head, as if the voices were trying to enter his mind. Pedro tried to resist, but the words began to form images in his mind, images of people he had never known, but who seemed strangely familiar. He saw flashes of an ancient time, where rituals were performed in the forest, rituals of sacrifice and invocation. He saw hooded figures around the circle of candles, and something, a dark presence, being called to this world. Pedro began to understand that the cabin wasn't just a shelter, but a portal, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the dead was thinner. And somehow, he had been drawn to that place, perhaps to be the next victim of the ancient rituals. Desperate, Pedro tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper was now deafening, and he felt he was losing control over his own mind. He needed to get out, but something wouldn't let him go so easily. Chapter 6. The Struggle for Sanity. As the voices in his head grew louder, Pedro began to lose track of time. He didn't know if minutes, hours, or days had passed since he entered the cabin. The darkness around him seemed alive, pulsating, as if it was waiting to engulf him. He tried to turn on his flashlight again, but the battery was dead. With no other choice, he began to fumble in the dark, trying to find a way out. Every step seemed to take him deeper into the darkness, and the cabin's walls seemed to close in around him. The voices continued, whispering ancient secrets and promises of eternal terror. Pedro felt he was on the brink of madness, but refused to give in. He knew that if he lost control, he would never leave that place. Suddenly, he tripped over something on the floor. As he bent down to feel what it was, he realized it was an old book with a leather cover and yellowed pages. The words in the book were unreadable, but he felt they contained secrets that could help him escape. Pedro began flipping through the book frantically, but the pages seemed to move on their own, always returning to the same symbol he had seen on the floor. Desperate, he tried to tear the page, but the paper seemed made of something stronger than he could break. The voices grew louder, laughing, mocking his attempt to escape. Pedro knew he was running out of time. Chapter 7. The Forbidden Ritual. The cabin now seemed alive, with the walls pulsating to the rhythm of the voices in his head. Pedro knew he had to act quickly. He remembered the symbol on the floor and the circle of candles. Perhaps, somehow, this was related to what was happening to him. Unsure of what to do, he knelt in the center of the circle and began tracing the symbol with his fingers. As he did, he felt a strange energy coursing through his body, as if something was trying to make contact with him. The candles around him began to light up on their own, casting a dim light that only heightened the sense of terror. Pedro heard a loud crack, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from inside his own mind. It was a voice different from the others, stronger, clearer. It instructed him to repeat words in a language he didn't know, but somehow made sense. Pedro hesitated, but felt he had no choice. With a trembling voice, he began reciting the words, and the cabin trembled. The darkness around him solidified, forming indistinct figures that began to approach. Pedro was at the center of something very old, very dangerous, but felt this was his only chance to escape. Chapter 8. The Price of Knowledge. As the figures around him became more distinct, Pedro realized he was surrounded by spirits, the same ones he had seen in his visions. They were the souls of those who had performed the ritual before him, trapped between worlds, unable to move on. The voice in his head continued to guide him, but now demanded something in return. To escape, Pedro would have to offer a sacrifice, something he valued more than his own life. He didn't know what this meant, but the idea of being trapped there forever terrified him. Pedro tried to negotiate, plead for a way out, but the figures around him only watched in silence, their empty eyes fixed on him. The voice told him he had been chosen, in his presence there was no accident but part of a cycle that had been repeating for centuries. The sacrifice was the key to breaking this cycle, but Pedro knew the price would be high. With trembling hands, he knelt in the circle and began to think about what he could offer. His sanity, his soul, his future. Nothing seemed sufficient. The figures began to approach, their distorted forms almost touching Pedro. He felt the despair grow, but the voice in his head whispered a final offer. Pedro would have to decide quickly before the figures consumed him. Chapter 9. The Final Choice. With terror gripping his heart, Pedro knew he couldn't escape without making a choice. The voice in his head was now clearer, almost familiar, as if it had always been there, waiting to be heard. It offered Pedro a way out, but the price was higher than he could imagine. He would have to sacrifice his memory, erase everything that made him who he was. In return, he could leave the cabin, but without remembering anything about himself, without knowing who he was or where he came from. Pedro hesitated. The idea of losing his identity was terrifying, but the alternative was even worse, being trapped in the cabin with the lost souls forever. The figures around him began whispering again, encouraging him to accept the offer. Pedro felt tears streaming down his face as the darkness closed in. He knew he had no other choice. With a desperate scream, he accepted the offer, and everything around him exploded in light. The cabin, the figures, the voices, everything disappeared in an instant. Pedro felt a sharp pain in his mind, as if something was being forcibly removed. Then, everything went silent. Chapter 10. The Return. When Pedro opened his eyes, he was back at the entrance of the forest, lying on the ground. The sun was shining in the sky, and the village of Cerro Negro was in sight, in the distance. He tried to get up, but a wave of dizziness hit him, and he fell to his knees. Pedro looked around, but didn't recognize anything. His mind was blank, as if someone had erased all his memories. He didn't know who he was, where he came from, or how he got there. He tried to remember, but all he found was emptiness. As he walked toward the village, he felt a strange sense of deja vu, but couldn't understand why. When he arrived in the village, the residents watched him curiously, but no one recognized him. Pedro felt a deep sadness, but didn't know why. He was a stranger to everyone, including himself. As time passed, Pedro tried to rebuild his life, but something always pulled him back to that night in the forest, though he couldn't remember what happened. The Whispering Forest remained a mystery, and Pedro, now without memories, became part of the new legend. It is said that he still wanders through the village, searching for answers he will never find, for the price he paid to escape was his own identity, and that is a burden he will carry forever. And so, the story of Pedro comes to a haunting close. A tale of curiosity turned nightmare, where the search for the truth led to a fate worse than death. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales like this one. And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved, because the price of knowledge can be your very soul. Until next time, stay safe, and beware of the darkness that may be closer than you think.